Okay, well, tonight we're going to take Daniel and the lion's den. And on the one hand, it's a very well-known story to you, and yet at the same time, looking at it carefully may reveal some nuances that hopefully will be constructive. But we'll also share with you some, I think, will be surprises. What does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? What does the lion's den have to do with Christmas? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. We're in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. And first thing I might mention, there's some ambiguity about Darius the Mede. He comes up several times. And Darius may be an honorable title. It may mean simply the holder of the scepter. But it is used of 5 later Persian rulers. And there are at least 4 conjectures as to who Darius is, as referred to in chapter 5 in part and also in this chapter. Some scholars feel that it's actually an allusion to Cyrus, the top guy himself. Donald Weissman of the British Museum published that view. Others feel it's the son of Cyrus, Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. And there are reputable authors that hold that view. But it is very clear also that Darius is an appointed guy. So that causes me to dismiss those first 2, personally at least, because in Daniel 9, we'll discover when we get there, he's clearly appointed. In fact, one of the likely people that he would be appointed with would be Ugbaru. And by the way, that's similar to Gubaru. It's just different ways of spelling the same name. He was the governor of Gutium. He was the general of the Persians that conquered Babylon for Cyrus. And so there are several competent scholars that make that case. And Ugbaru, you may recall, on October 12th of 539, he entered Babylon the night of Belshazzar's feast. We went through that in detail time before last, as you recall, the famous handwriting on the wall and all of that. But you see, it was just about 2 weeks after that Cyrus makes his grand entrance. And the history seems to indicate that Cyrus then appointed Ugbaru to rule Babylon, not the Persian Empire. Cyrus ruled the whole Persian Empire, but he did such a magnificent job conquering this presumably impregnable city that he was appointed, and I personally suspect he's the one that Darius is referring to. But in any case, on November 6th, only a very short time later, he died. He was, after all, we don't know that he was 62 when he took over, because the last verse of chapter 5 told us that. And so the Darius that closes chapter 5 may be the title that was given to Ugbaru, the general that accomplished it. And by the way, some of your books will say Ugbaru, some say Gabaru. That's an alternate spelling in the Aramaic. Gobrias is the Greek equivalent of all of that. And that's listed in a number of records. We have pretty good visibility of that. So Darius is whoever you want it to be. We'll move on. Okay. Daniel in the lion's den. This is one of those episodes in the Old Testament that gets named in the famous Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11. When you get down to verse 33 of Hebrews 11, it says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. So if you want a subtitle for this, we can just say Lockjaw in the Lion's Den or something like that and move on. Let's just jump into Daniel 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, that the king should have no damage. And now Daniel, you realize, is about 83 years old here. But he also has about 66 years in public office under Babylon. So he's in a position of honor here. He was an exceptional administrator, obviously, because if nothing else, because of his extensive experience under Nebuchadnezzar, very intimate experience with Nebuchadnezzar for virtually 40 years. So it's interesting, Darius sets up 120 princes. Those are not necessarily 120 areas that each had. They could just been officers in some kind of bureaucratic sense. There's a lot of discussions about that. We can spare ourselves here. But in any case, the 120 were over the whole kingdom, and they each reported, well, collectively they reported to 3 presidents, of which Daniel was the first. Not just one of the 3, but the first. This, you got to stand back and be impressed with this young man. He was kidnapped, in effect, as a teenager brought into slavery to Babylon, and through the exploits that we read in chapter 2 and following, he rises to become the prime minister of this world empire under Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, he becomes very intimate with Nebuchadnezzar. I believe when Nebuchadnezzar went through his 7 years of convalescence, the Talmud tells us that it was Daniel that took care of him. So he's a remarkable human being. But now Babylon is taken over by their enemies, the Persians. And he emerges to be the top guy among the, he's right under the top guy, at least in the Babylonian part of it, because Darius is not in charge of the whole Persian Empire, the Babylonian portion of it. And so we have these three presidents, of whom Daniel was the first. And okay, so then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? What do you think goes along with that? Envy. How do you think that sat with the regulars? I mean, this old Jewish man's going to be put in charge. You think they're excited about that? It gets more complicated, but we'll take that when it comes later. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion or fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault in him. Boy, wouldn't you and I wish that our report card was like that? They could find no occasion or fault in him. You know, in an election year, you watch the rhetoric, not just for the top guys, but everybody gets involved in politics. Boy, the media just digs out all the dirt. And you get the impression that, there's just nobody with clean hands in today's world. It's interesting that his rivals, 120 of them, could find no occasion or fault. For he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Not that he breaks the law, but because you can count on him keeping the law. It's interesting, he often says that if you're being tried as a Christian, there's not enough evidence to convict you. I remember what Peter Drucker said when somebody asked him, he's a very prolific author in management literature, somebody asked him if he was a Christian. He says, that's for you to tell me. What a perceptive answer. What a perceptive answer. Well, in any case, these guys are obviously going to gang up on Daniel. They know the only chance they have is to find an occasion of his faithfulness in practice. What a guy this is. So then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. By the way, this is an interesting phrase because this whole assumed divinity of kings, if you study world history, you're very familiar with this concept that's very early of the divinity of kings. How many have heard that term, have studied that? I got a history up here that knows all about divinity. The divine right of the kings, right? You know where that starts? Anybody know where that starts? Genesis 6. I'll leave you with that, do your homework, but we'll move on. In any case, King Darius lived forever, and all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, and the counselors, and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Boy, what an ego trip they got the king on. You're going to force people under penalty of death to ask no God for anything except to you. All the presidents of the kingdom. Now that's a lie, of course, because they certainly didn't ask Daniel to be part of this, did they? But see, they just represent that all of us presidents agree, king. All the governors, princes, counselors, captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree. Now, one of the things you'll learn here very quickly, and you may remember from the book of Esther, if you study the book of Esther, the Persian administration was very different than the Babylonian. Nebuchadnezzar was above the law. Whom he would, he could kill. And whom he chose not to, he didn't have to. He was above the law. He was an absolute despot, maybe the most absolute despot that ever lived. The Persians had a different system. The king was not above the law. once he signed a law, he was stuck with it. He couldn't change it. Sounds bizarre to us, but that's the way it was. And that was the dilemma in the book of Esther. When he realizes he made a huge mistake under the counsel of Haman, all he could do, all the Jews were going to kill, all he could do is issue an edict that the Jews were entitled to fight back. And if you know the story of Esther, that's a key aspect of the book of Esther. Well, it's also a very key aspect here because Darius is going to regret very deeply that these guys talked him into this this ego trip. That whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast in the den of lions. They obviously, this is called entrapment. They're trying to nail him. So now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. In other words, once he signs this, even the king can't change it. Wherefore, King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Big mistake. Big mistake. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, what did he do? Boy, how interesting. He knew the writing was signed. What's the first thing he did? Nothing out of the unusual. He went into his house, and his windows being open in his bedchamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Boy, this little verse is packed with a lot of insight here. Jerusalem was a couple of 100 miles to the west in rubble. Why have the windows towards Jerusalem? Because that was what he was called to do. That's what the scripture calls him to do in 2 Chronicles 6 and a number of places. 1 Kings 8 and so on. David's Psalms is full of that. So that was he had his windows open towards Jerusalem, and he kneeled upon his knees. Now, I think we are all sophisticated enough to realize you can pray any way you like. You can pray while you're driving a car. You can pray, a lot of us do. A lot of us need to very quickly on some occasions. But it's interesting that in the scripture, Old and New Testament, you can find people on their knees. The Lord was on his knees in Luke 22 and so forth. It's interesting that in chapter 3, the Jewish young men were honored for not being on their knees. Remember? Okay. But Stephen was on his knees in Acts 7, Peter in Acts 9, and you can make a case that it certainly is not a mistake to be on your knees. In fact, you'll also find, if you really study worship, that the Levites were prostrate before the Holy of Holies and so on. So, obviously, your adoration and worship of God is in the spirit, not physical, but I think it's helpful for us to have it all consistent. In any case, he kneeled upon his knees. How often? 3 times a day. Most of us feel pretty good if we spend a half an hour each day, starting the day off, or finishing the day, or better yet, both. Daniel did it 3 times a day, and he prayed. Gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. In other words, this was his routine. He didn't do it because it was signed. He just didn't let the fact that this law was signed interrupt his commitment. Boy, there's a lot of lessons in this. Well, then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And by the way, the language implies it was a tumult. It wasn't that they assembled. There was like a riot. They really made a thing of it. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. He said to the king, Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? In other words, they want to make sure he signed it before they bring this up. The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, and that's intended to be a slur here, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. Notice who he's displeased with. He's not displeased at Daniel. He's displeased with himself because at this point he recognizes that he's been set up, that this has been a trap that these envious rivals have done this, used him to set this up. So he sort of displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till going down to the sun to deliver him. He went, I assume what he did, he went to his attorneys, tried to find a loophole, tried to find some way. And apparently there were legal restrictions that even the king could not undo this document that they got him to sign. It's interesting to see where the king's heart is. I see a parallel between this king and Nebuchadnezzar. Both of them are on Daniel's side. And then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians is that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. And obviously, if he could have been, he would have found a way, because he apparently worked all day with his advisors to find a way. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Boy, boy, boy. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, notice where Daniel's getting his encouragement from. The king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Now some commentators say that's just probably wishful thinking. Some commentators assume that he probably knew what happened back in Babylon in chapter 3 with the fiery furnace, although that didn't involve Daniel, interestingly enough. But anyway, let's not get into that here. I personally take that, I suspect that the king was certainly apprehensive about it, but I think the king had at least some confidence that the God that Daniel worshiped was effectual, and you'll see that manifests itself in a little bit here. Cast him in the den of lions. Now, those you are prophecy buffs, what I'll suggest Daniel's challenge is not to receive the mark of the beast, right? You gonna let me get away with that? Okay. Oh, yeah. Pretty bad, isn't it? Yeah. Somebody gave me a T-shirt recently that had the word of God is like a lion. You turn it loose, it'll defend itself. And it attributed that to me, and I was very flattered with the T-shirt. I said, I never said that, but it sure sounds like me. But I did find it on one of my old tapes. I guess I did say that once. Anyway, verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. Notice this. They sealed this thing. A stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords. And that was his double sealed. Why? So the king couldn't let him out. Interesting situation here. Sealed with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. And the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. I personally suspect that Daniel had a better night of it than he did. It wouldn't surprise me if Daniel had a good nap. But the king didn't. He was up all night. Tells you where his heart is. The king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God. Now that's quite a title. Boy, would I love someone who's calling me, Chuck, a servant of the living God. I'd love to have that identity, man. O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Obviously he has a doubt in his mind, and he has an expectation, but he certainly has a doubt in his mind. Then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Boy, this guy Daniel. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him. Because, why? He believed in his God. And by the way, the word here is a little weak. He did more than believe in his God. He relied on that belief. That's called faith. Faith is not just believing. James tells us that the devils also believe and tremble. Believing is not enough. Relying on. You may believe that chair holds your weight, But until you're sitting on it, you're not trusting it. You follow what I'm saying? Clumsy example, but you get the idea. Well, we're not through. There's a principle called lex talionis that the king applies here. And by the way, just some footnotes here. We did a TV special many years ago, CBS TV special, and they got all kinds of expert archaeological. They have found evidence that the Persians did have lions' dens, by the way. And there's this Persian custom has been archaeologically confirmed, apparently. But anyway, and the king commanded, and they brought these men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. Get this, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Now these people, you find people saying, well, Daniel survived it because they had a bunch of old lions that weren't that hungry, and you have all these stupid conjectures. See, they're trying to say there's even a bigger miracle. Because after that, they threw 120 of these guys in there, and the lions apparently weren't satisfied till they got them all, and their wives and their kids. Lex talionis, eye for eye. This is the penalty for false witnesses. We see it here, and it's a term in the Aramaic for slander that's involved on these things. The term for slander is to eat the pieces of a man. There's an interesting link, and this is found in the Assyrian and Amarna letters. But anyway. It's interesting, when Daniel came out in the morning, he was the gainer. The king approved him, the king admired him, the king loved him. Everybody heard of it. And well, let's go on here and see. The king Darius wrote unto all the people, nations, and languages. Now you need to embrace this. You need to realize how big the empire was. This is bigger than the Babylonian Empire. Then the king Darius wrote unto all people, all nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. I wouldn't get into a debate where that boundary is, but it certainly is extensive. What did he write? Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree. This is first person singular with Darius. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. What a statement. What a statement. He delivereth and rescueth, he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and even in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It says, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It's possible that can be translated even in making Darius Cyrus. There are some people on the basis of this say that Darius could be one of the many titles of Cyrus. And I'm not here to debate that. There's some good scholars that believe that. There's some that have a different view, and that's fine. But in any case, so ends the thing. But I didn't want to let you go off this early, so I thought we'd raise some other issues. So there's some parallels here. As we look at this, the faithful remnant, prophetically, there is a faithful remnant in the end times. And a number, Dennett, Gabeline, Lang, Ironside, and a number of Newell and others, that use the lion den thing as a prophetic anticipatory type. Looking at that's pretty straightforward. Others feel it also foreshadows the man of sin, claiming divine honors under the penalty of death, which certainly he does in Revelation 7, 12, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and so forth. And it probably does. I'm not attracted to that because I don't really see Darius in that role. He got tricked, if you will. He wasn't, I don't see him in a sinister role here, strangely enough. We have to, of course, point out that God can deal with roaring lions, and there is a roaring lion that is going out to get you. 1 Peter 5:8. Who goes about as a roaring lion? Satan. So you may want to put 1 Peter 5:8 and 2 Timothy 4:17 in your notes. And, of course, Revelation 13:2. And, of course, as I quipped before, Daniel did not receive the mark of the beast. as the seal of the 144,000. They don't receive, they get sealed, so they don't receive the mark of the beast in Revelation chapter 7 and Revelation 14. Those are pretty straightforward for those of you that are looking at the prophetic typology possibilities here. But let's get more to practical lessons. What are the lessons of this famous event? Well, certainly safety and persecution. Now, we shouldn't get too comfortable. You know, it's funny how many people in America get all hung up about the Great Tribulation. Is the church going to go through tribulation now? Church is not going to go through that period called the Great Tribulation, I believe, but where do we get the arrogance to presume that we're going to be exempt from what most of the world for most of the last 1900 years has had to endure? It's called persecution. Not the Great Tribulation, that's a very specific thing. No, persecution. Now, in America, we've had 2 centuries of pretty comfortable going. It was founded on by some very far-seated and very committed people. But we've allowed ourselves to yield, inch by inch, our heritage to those that are committed to separating us from that heritage. And as you watch the political process in this country in the recent decades, it looks like it's really on the skids. There are people that are out to separate you from your protections of freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. And they're succeeding. The hate laws in Canada being a horrible example of this sort of thing. So safety and persecution may be a topic that's going to be far closer to all of us as time goes on here. The faithfulness of God is an issue here. Daniel didn't sweat it. He knew that God would take care of him. That doesn't mean he necessarily was going to survive the ordeal. There were people that trusted God that got voluntarily burned at the stake. And so we need to understand the faithfulness of God doesn't guarantee that God may not have a purpose in the result, a result that's a little different than we may be anticipating. But certainly the lessons here are inspiring, the inspiring faith of the one consecrated. Daniel's performance here is impressive. In fact, there's probably far more to learn about Daniel's commitment than there is about his surviving the ordeal. Because he survived the ordeal because God ordained it that it would. But in any case, his commitment, his faithfulness in not altering his pattern despite the laws that were being signed are impressive. Blessing, obeying God rather than men. All of us are going to have that challenge. It's coming up sooner than we probably recognize. And there is a reward of separation, separating yourself from the common. God is equal to every emergency. 1 Chronicles 22:13 is a key verse here. Thou shalt prosper if thou takest heed. That doesn't mean we should be ignorant. We should take heed, but we need to know what we're doing.